So today we're going to talk about the recent federal cannabis changes. This includes the changes to the definition of hemp, which was introduced under the Appropriations Act, as well as the executive order on marijuana rescheduling. Um, we're going to dive into them, but before we dive into them, I do want to set the context a little bit for some other developments that took place prior to those actions that got us to where we are now. So we're going to take a little history lesson before we get to today. The federal rules around cannabis have existed since the 1600s. There have been many different rules, but most significantly, in 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act. And what the Controlled Substances Act did is it set up our current scheduling, where it categorizes drugs into five different categories. And marijuana, which under the Controlled Substances Act is broadly defined as all parts of the cannabis sativa plant, its seeds, resin, and any compounds, manufacturers, salts, derivatives, and preparations of the plant, excluding certain parts of the plant, which are certain mature stalks and sterilized seeds. So here we have a very complicated definition of marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act, and marijuana was placed under Schedule 1, the most restrictive category of substances, along with heroin and LSD. Schedule 1 status signifies that a substance is deemed to have a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and is unsafe even under medical supervision. This classification set the tone for decades of federal cannabis policy, prioritizing enforcement over scientific inquiry. For many researchers, this created significant barriers, including extensive DEA registration requirements, heightened security protocols, and strict limitations on the sources of cannabis that could be used in studies. From this point forward, cannabis research in the United States was fundamentally shaped and constrained by marijuana's Schedule 1 status. Moving ahead a little bit, thank you very much. Moving ahead a little bit, um, we are now going to move into a little bit more modern time into 2018. In 2018, Congress passed the 2018 Farm Bill, which introduced a pivotal shift to federal cannabis policy by carving out a narrow exception for the CSA's definition of marijuana. For the first time, federal law distinguished hemp from marijuana based on a chemical composition rather than the plant species alone. Hemp was defined as cannabis sativa L and any parts of the plant containing no more than 0.3% delta-9 THC on a dry weight basis. While hemp and marijuana originate from the same plant species, they became legally distinct under federal law, marijuana remaining a controlled substance, while hemp falling outside of the Controlled Substances Act entirely. This definitional split opened the doors to a rapidly growing market for hemp-derived cannabinoid products. So during the Biden administration, federal cannabis reform was accelerated, particularly on the research and criminal justice reform fronts. In October of 2022, the president initiated a formal review of marijuana's scheduling and issued mass pardons for federal simple possession offenses. In December of 2022, Congress enacted the Medical Marijuana and Cannabidiol Research Expansion Act, which, among other things, imposed new requirements on DEA to expedite registration for marijuana researchers. In August 2023, the Department of Health and Human Services completed its scientific and medical review of marijuana at the direction of the president. As part of this process, HHS's evaluation concluded that marijuana should be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. This is because there was accepted medical uses of cannabis found in scientific literature. This recommendation was significant because it marked for a first time that a federal health agency concluded that marijuana had accepted medical use and it should not meet the statutory definition for Schedule 1. For researchers, the HHS recommendation signaled a potential shift away from the most restrictive research controls, though it did not itself change marijuana's legal status. That job rests with the Drug Enforcement Administration. So what happened next? In May 2024, the DEA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking to reclassify marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, formally initiating the administrative rulemaking process under the Controlled Substances Act. This action reflects DEA's preliminary agreement with HHS's scientific and medical findings. The notice of proposed rulemaking opened a public comment period and triggered additional procedural steps, including hearings, interagency reviews, and other things, before any rule could be issued. If finalized, rescheduling marijuana to Schedule 3 would reduce the regulatory burden for cannabis research, easing registration requirements, and potentially expanding access to research materials, although DEA oversight would still remain. All right, so that gets us to where we are now, the exciting stuff. Okay, so under Trump's second term, Congress and the White House both took actions that impacted cannabis and hemp. In November 2025, Congress enacted the Continuing Appropriations Act, which included statutory language revising the federal definition of hemp. And then in December 2025, President Trump signed an executive order directing the Attorney General to complete the administrative process to reclassify marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 under the Controlled Substances Act. This executive order also called on Congress to work with the administration to update the statutory definition related to hemp-derived cannabinoid products, reflecting back to the Appropriations Act. So, specific to the Appropriations Act. The long name for this act, okay, so that's the Continuing Appropriations Agriculture Legislative Branch Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Extension Act of 2026, also known as HR 5371, or I'm just going to refer to it as the Appropriations Act, which ended the federal government shutdown. This act included one of the most consequential changes to federal hemp policy since that 2018 Farm Bill. The Farm Bill, the Appropriations Act, revised the federal statutory definition of hemp. The revised definition focused on total THC rather than solely on Delta-9 THC. This means that all forms of THC compounds found in the plant, including THCA and other psychoactive cannabinoids, are now counted towards the total allowable THC limit. So anything under 0.3% THC of any kind is, if it's under, it's hemp. If it's over 0.3% THC of any kind, it's considered marijuana. So this new law explicitly excludes from hemp definition many products that were previously lawful under the 2018 Farm Bill. Among those exclusions are intermediate or final hemp-derived products that exceed the defined total THC threshold. Products containing cannabinoids that are not naturally not naturally produced by the plant, but are synthesized outside of the plant. And finished products with more than a minimal total THC per container. So for example, the statutory cap of the 0.4 milligrams per container has been adopted. Never mind. So finished products more than a minimum total of THC per container. Because the Controlled Substances Act excludes hemp by reference to the statutory definition, narrowing the hemp's definition may cause many intoxicating hemp-derived cannabinoid products, including Delta 8, Delta 10, THCA products, to fall back within the controlled substances definition of marijuana and therefore regulated by the Controlled Substances Act again. This new definition is scheduled to take place 1 year after the enactment of the Appropriations Act, so effectively November 12th, 2026. Thank you. Just to kind of more visually try to explain what this change means, I put together this very, very, very crude Venn diagram. In my head, I have visions of being a more creative person. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them, and this is to the extent of my creative abilities to create something fancy. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that under the current framework, which right now we're still existing under, right? We have the Farm Bill definition of hemp on one side, and then the CSA definition of marijuana on the other side. And as you can see, under the Farm Bill, hemp is defined as that plant which has less than 0.3% Delta 9 THC, while marijuana is greater than 0.3% Delta 9 THC. But there was a lot of ambiguity between these two laws that unfortunately created this big market for synthetically derived hemp products, which it was never really clear where it kind of landed on. And so what this Appropriations Act language tries to do is to try to separate the definition a little bit more. And what it inadvertently does is it kicks some things that were controlled under hemp back to be under the framework of the CSA to be included in the definition of marijuana. There's still going to be some overlap between the two because one, we're still talking about the same plant, but really what is the determining factor of where it will fall is the total THC content as well as the final versions of those products that are produced. So that was the Appropriations Act changes. Now, for the executive order that Trump signed back in December, um, that executive order directs the Attorney General to take all necessary steps to complete the federal administrative process of moving marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 under the CSA. This order builds upon those earlier actions under the Biden administration. And what this executive order does is that, again, it calls upon the Attorney General to complete the rulemaking process, but it does not itself reschedule marijuana, nor does it change the legal status of marijuana in any way. The order, though, signifies that the executive branch is committed to finishing the rescheduling products and putting pressure on the DOJ and the DEA to expedite the remaining administrative steps to rescheduling.
Can I just
The
jump in
or
for a
Yep.
moment real quick? So I see something on this slide, THC limits per serving and per container. And you were kind of starting to talk about that on the last or one of the prior slides was like the 0.4. Do we want to talk about that now or do we want to like wait till a later slide?
We can talk about that. So I think let me just so of the executive order, right? So one part is calling upon DEA to complete the rulemaking under the CSA, but the other part of the executive order calls upon Congress to clarify the framework for hemp-derived cannabinoid products and to appropriately and to provide any guidance for what was issued under the or passed under the Appropriations Act. So there was two parts to it, right? And so this is that other part to basically clarify what Congress intended with the new definition of final hemp-derived cannabinoid products.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me know. Feel free to jump in, Christina, if you want to add anything to that too.
Nope, I just wanted to kind of connect it back to it because I knew where you were going and I knew why we paused. So I wanted to just, be able to name that specifically.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so that it's it kind of gets us to, okay, what does this all mean? Right? And what it really means is, there are some things that these new changes bring about, but I want to be clear that there are some things that are not going to change. So, in terms of what these changes could mean is that marijuana is no longer treated as having no accepted medical use under federal law if rescheduling proceeds. If rescheduling proceeds, some of those research barriers that I know are frustrating and head spinning to have to navigate, some of them would be reduced, but not entirely removed, right? DEA is not going away as they still have oversight over Schedule 3 substances, and there's still things that need to be met under the CSA. Um, there are some tax implications for placing marijuana under a Schedule 3, meaning that businesses can deduct normal business deductions who are involved in marijuana businesses. This, however, does not mean that past convictions are automatically expunged. There's no blanket clemency or retroactive relief created by rescheduling alone. And then for hemp specifically, right? What do these changes mean? It's that hemp definitions are tightened, particularly around intoxicating hemp-derived cannabinoids. But they're not entirely, hemp is not entirely deregulated. Certain hemp products are still are going to actually face renewed federal restrictions.
Just really quickly, sorry to interject. On the note of changes to like expungement processes, it's a little bit kind of broader than that. There have been no changes to any criminal legal aspects on any level of government that would occur or will occur, including no provisions for retroactive remedies such as expungement or the blanket clemency paths. So, from a social impact perspective, there are no changes to the criminalization aspects of cannabis.
Yep. Thank you. All right. I think probably the most productive part of the session will be the Q&A, and I'm happy to take any questions from anyone. Thank you.
And we're clearly a pretty chill group. Feel free to just shout some questions out, put them in chat. I know I have a ton of questions. I suspect Agnes, you also have a ton of questions, but we want to hear what you all have questions about, concerns, things you're excited about. PWCE, I'm guessing that's not your name, but I'm going to refer to you as such because that's your screen name. Jump on in.
That has to do with how you log into Teams. I am Paul Weaver with Chip Energy. Could you talk a little bit about industrial hemp and how these new rules are going to affect or not affect it in November?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, interestingly enough, in the Appropriations Act, Congress specifically separated industrial hemp from hemp writ large. And industrial hemp, the way that it is defined in the Appropriations Act, is continues to be removed from the Controlled Substances Act, right? So as it was under the Farm Bill, industrial hemp will continue to be excluded from the CSA. And there's a definition that now is written within the Appropriations Act.
So there is a continued path separation.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
So I put one of my questions in the chat.
Thank you.
It's asking about the current view of non-psychoactive cannabinoids, you know, and how the USDA, FDA currently viewing them, and are they separating them, the non-psychoactive naturally occurring cannabinoids from synthetic or maybe I shouldn't say synthetic, converted cannabinoids. So the ones that are made from excess CBD, right? Um, and whether or not that separation is based on psychoactivity um, or or just that they were made by converting some other product.
So, Agnes, but before you jump in, Agnes, and I believe Agnes would also take the same position. We don't know how the USDA and FDA view any of those things. So we can't offer that perspective, but we can perhaps, Agnes, offer what we suspect based on what the language itself is.
Yeah, and I will tell you, I think the USD and FDA probably wouldn't hold a position because DEA would hold a position, and USDA and FDA would concede to the position that DEA takes. Um, and and that's because again, so with this change in the definition of hemp, what ends up happening is that things that were previously thought of as no longer a scheduled substance are now going to be put back into the definition of marijuana. And what that does then is that the purview goes back under DEA. Um, in terms of these non-psychoactive compounds, the way that the Appropriations Act considers them is THC levels, but all THC levels. And what so if the total THC amount within the plant is more than 0.3% THC, then it kind of goes back under the purview of DEA under the Controlled Substances Act. If it's not, it's outside, right? But in terms of what actually will meet that definition when we get into some of those gray areas, those overlapping areas, I suspect that we will need to look to DEA to how they, in my conservative approach, look to DEA to see how they would approach it, especially within the proposed rulemaking that they will continue with for defining marijuana.
And just really quickly, Agnes, on the note of like roles of different federal agencies, the FDA was
Mhm.
expected to do something in the Appropriations Act. Can you talk a little bit about what that something is and then how that role kind of connects to the larger regulatory landscape?
Yes. So the FDA, under the Appropriations Act, the FDA is responsible for publishing a list of all known, I believe it is psychoactive components of the plant. And I have not yet seen anything yet from the FDA in response to that. The USDA remains having purview over industrial hemp.
What other questions do folks have? Anyone interested in the wonky mechanics of rulemaking or not?
Why don't Christina tell us about the rulemaking? Because to me, I feel like it's been one of those situations where it's like, oh my gosh, grab the popcorn. This is so what is going on here?
So, rulemaking is governed by a federal legislation in and of itself. So there are procedural steps that must happen. Some of those are in the context of the CSA, not just an open like notice and comment period, but also then the ability for folks to request hearings and hold public hearings that also involve comment in those hearings themselves. So the way that it got kind of stalled, if you will, under the actions taken under the Biden administration is part of the rulemaking process itself. So there were people who were scheduled to hold hearings that were pro cannabis rescheduling who caught some indication of ex parte communications between the DEA and anti-cannabis folks who were also looking to be involved in hearings. Ex parte communication is a legal term, and that means functionally, I'm not an attorney with the caveat, it functionally means communication without all parties involved, or would be like closed door, like back channeling that skirts the legal requirements for sharing information with involved parties, if you will. So they alleged to the administrative law judge overseeing the rulemaking process that these ex parte communications had occurred and they would impact the outcomes of the process. The judge denied that motion, but allowed them to file an appeal. The appeal is filed to the DEA administrator, Milgram, I believe, was at that point. Was it Ann at that point? Ann Milgram was the administrator. So that is where it stopped. These are procedural steps, part of the judge's ruling by denying the motion, but allowing those, what I'm going to call stakeholders or interested parties to file the appeal, was requiring reports every 90 days from the DEA and the parties who had filed the appeal. That has largely just stalled and not happened. And as a result of the appeal, given the gravity of ex parte communications in a legal context, they halted the hearing process to allow the other aspect of the rulemaking, that appeal process, to play out. It has just completely stalled. The DEA has not attended to that appeal. And so the executive order directs the Attorney General to expedite the rescheduling process, but in a legal context, expedite it is kind of a nothing burger, if you will. Like it doesn't have a meaning. So we have an interrupted rescheduling process by way of like following legally available procedural steps that has been halted, and an executive order that directs the AG to expedite the process. However, the rulemaking aspects that are the holdup need to play out irrespective of the executive order. Was that wonky enough for you, Agnes? And Reggie, I saw you come off camera as well, so I wasn't sure if you wanted to wonk out or...
Well, no, I had another question that I think Agnes started to answer. My question was, so, and I'm trying to get at, whether cannabinoids themselves are illegal or the plant is illegal, right? Because now scientists have found CBD, CBG, and some other cannabinoids are being made in a bunch of other plants, rhododendrons, trees that are in the family Trema, and Helichrysum, the whole Helichrysum family, which is a whole bunch of other plants, right? So, and they're chemically identical to the versions of those compounds you find in cannabis. So, are the cannabinoids that come from those plants are illegal, or is it really just the fact that it doesn't matter if they're psychoactive or not, and it's just because it's cannabis, which then raises a whole other set of questions, because now we're calling a whole plant like we're making a whole plant illegal for no reason when there are versions of that plant that don't have intoxicating compounds, right? So I'm just trying to understand like what so are they trying to regulate a plant or a an offensive compound, right? And where does the analog rule fit into this, since you'd think that their own rules would have some involvement in how this is going about? But okay, and now you're going to tell me that I'm being rational. Sorry. Okay. I saw the look on your face, but yeah.
Agnes, do you want to start?
Yeah, yeah. So I was going to say that, right? So unfortunately, right, there are a lot of decisions that are being made that aren't scientifically informed, right? And that's one of the biggest challenges that we face in this space is that many of these decisions, I think, lack the scientific expertise needed to inform them, right? And so you ask a really good question, but the way that I understand that this is defined is that we're talking about the plant and its derivatives, right? And so if those compounds exist elsewhere but aren't derived from the marijuana plant, that they are not regulated as marijuana. And then in terms of Dawn, I see that you also asked a question about how are similar effects to cannabinoids defined. And I think that same, very similar answer, right? I mean, again, we're talking about these rules that are very complex and head spinning and don't make a lot of sense because they're not scientifically informed. I don't think that there is a definition for similar effects to cannabinoids, but I think that is part of what FDA's role is to try to help identify those.
That would also map with how I am assuming the next steps might play out based on the requirement for the FDA to kind of inventory those types of well. The other thing I would also kind of go back to what you were talking about, Reggie, you're talking about legal interpretation of statute that has not been implemented, and because it's still there is nothing to implement, it's still going through the rulemaking process. But those are logical questions from that like perspective and frame, but the practical reality is it's not even statute. You have a bill and you have an EO, right? With no regs or rules, because that is now we're back to the wonky stuff. Sorry, folks, but that's where we're stuck. So a lot of questions, interpretation, assumption, but those are legal, criminal, potentially questions that can't be determined until there are rules and statute and a timeline for implementation and what that implementation TBD will entail.
I mean, because it's almost like they're getting ready to create another freaking huge loophole, right? So, and bear with me here. So, if it's got to be derived from cannabis sativa, right? Somebody could take the THCA synthase gene, make a GMO version of tobacco, or make a GMO version of lettuce, right? Now it's not cannabis. Extract those things, extract THC from the plant, and now you've bypassed part of the problem, right? So again, I mean, it's almost as like they're getting ready to make the same mistake they made in 2018 when they made anything derived from hemp is legal, right? Like,
So I would put that in the bucket of unintended policy consequences. Um, I'm not saying that's like a satisfying answer, but the practical reality is without attention paid to the evidence base that exists, right, or available best practices to whatever it is you're trying to set policy for, So we're back to Agnes's point. It is not necessarily these policy decisions and conversations are not necessarily scientifically informed or rooted and grounded in the evidence base with the constructive disagreement that right that would help flesh out and refine not only policy but also rulemaking and actual implementation steps. So by way of having a more evidence and scientifically informed policymaking process, you can explore unintended consequences and try to mitigate in policymaking and rulemaking, but that now we're talking about a whole other thing. So the unfortunate reality, especially with policy that is impacting scientific realities, there are unintended consequences. But PWCE, I'm sorry, I've just got to lean in. Jump on in.
Okay, Christina, I want to put this into context as someone who is ignorant on cannabis and cannabinoids, or whatever they're called. I've read some of the legislation, and my context is that one, it was written the way it was written on purpose to make more confusion, and it's to target the shelf products, not the plant. Could you please tell me if I'm wrong?
Right and wrong is a space that I try and stay out of here, but I would say that I largely agree with your interpretation. And I think your interpretation is on point. Also to the point of meant to confuse or not, I am not a policymaker. I'm not a legislator. I'm not an attorney. It is not an uncommon tactic, but I don't know that I would say that was like top line intent here. It might be a anticipated byproduct of, but now we're assuming intent behind conversations and, processes that we were not involved in. Uh, it's a
Can I-
mess. Yes, shelf
yeah.
products, but take it away, Agnes.
Yeah. So, what the intent behind this change was, right, was that because there was a lot of the Farm Bill definition of hemp opened the doors for a lot of what was labeled as hemp-derived, products, hemp-derived CBD, hemp-derived, et cetera, to be created and found its way on many shelves, including gas stations, grocery stores, whatever, all these other places that weren't really being regulated and have found to be, in some cases, very intoxicating. And so that was the intent of the Appropriations Act, is to basically have those products come back under regulation, right? But still leaving the farming aspect, the agricultural component of the plant to remain as is, as was established under the 2018 Farm Bill. And, it unfortunately, there's some clarity, but now new complications that we have to wrangle with as we're trying to sort out what exactly these recent federal actions mean.
And I mean, to Agnes's point, the problem, if you will, that the hemp definitions are seeking to solve, or the new definitions, are attending to the loopholes created by the Farm Bill, which allowed this gray area. As some folks think it's black and white, some folks think it's shades of gray, and it's like totally fair game. Leaving that aside, resulting in unregulated products that there are consumer and public health safety concerns around unregulated products of this type, particularly when you start talking about extracts and contaminants, heavy metals, things like that. So the Farm Bill created a perceived or real, depending on your perspective, loophole that allowed this market unregulated to create products at gas stations, grocery stores, wherever, that are not bound by the same safety protocols and regs that exist in a regulated cannabis market, be it adult use or medical use. So unintended consequence, policy solution, seeking to mitigate. But to Reggie's point, does it just open the door for more loopholes? Does it restrict access in ways it was not intended to? These are the questions that I have, at least.
Regardless of the cannabis in the product on the shelf, the Food and Drug Administration has rights, and they can protect, based on the safety of human consumption, any product that's ingested. Am I wrong?
No, you're right. FDA's role in this is so they are involved post marketing, right? Once a product for something that isn't regulated as a controlled substance or even a drug or a botanical, their role is post marketing, and so that's why FDA's role was limited in being able to regulate or be involved in some way action around hemp derived products that were later found to be uh, uh, intoxicating um, when taken, especially in excess.
Practical reality is FDA has limited enforcement, like capacity and capabilities and like legal bounds, and they're historically understaffed. Tragically so, some folks might say. So,
When granddaughters start getting high from drinks that they got at the grocery store, um, I I believe that they'll have to take action.
Yeah, but it was exactly their mess up the first time that created the loophole um, that allowed those drinks that the granddaughters are getting high on, right? So again, it gets back to a lack of consideration, a lack of discussion with experts in experts in the field, and and lobbyists, basically. So
well,
I
now
know everything boils down to money in politics. I know, I know.
that- that's a whole other series of conversations. But again, yes, that's that's where we are. Agnes, any other thoughts on that?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, you're absolutely right. So FDA would be involved right after the fact. I think the intention of the Appropriations Act language is to make sure that those products don't get in the shelves to begin with.
Yeah. Mitigate the need for the after compliance, if you will.
The only thing I'll add is these rules are head spinning. They're not straightforward at all. There's, a lot of things that we still don't know, including the follow-up actions that other agencies are going to take resulting from the two recent federal actions, the Appropriations Act as well as the executive order. So I think in order to really get the full picture of what's happening, we will need to see how these other agencies respond to these recent actions.
And then the rulemaking to be picked back up, of course. But
Mhm.
PWC, jump on in.
Are, are the grocery stores and the gas stations that have legal tender going on right now to the most degree going to end up with a problem of the federal government seizing monetary assets based on the illegal cannabis associated with the drinks and the candy?
I think my perspective on that is it is a legal possibility, but has not played out that way thus far. I do know that multiple states that have an adult or medical or both have that market have explored ways, so locally within state, to address some of those concerns before they would have to take legal action, like law enforcement action. So it does end up in that kind of criminal offense pathway that would have to be, you would have to go down that pathway to be able to seize assets in that way. But again, I am not an attorney. So it is unlikely, I would suspect, that any action would be taken at scale. But Agnes, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
No, I agree with you. Yeah. I mean, I think right. Yeah, I think you said it just right.
But is Hy-Vee risking a financial hit if for some reason they decided to put this product in their stores? I'm just using them as an example. I don't know that they do right now, but
Is that
uh,
like a, sorry, is that like a grocery store or like a
yeah,
grocery?
Hy-Vee, Kroger,
Oh, okay. I mean, again, it's a theoretical possibility, but I would assume that those entities are actively engaging with general counsel and following what their counsel is suggesting. And I am not general counsel for anyone, but I would assume that general counsel would probably take a very risk-averse position and strongly discourage from those types of actions if the stores have not already made a decision to carry those types of products, because those types of products are available in many retail outlets currently in virtually all states in this country. Do we have any attorneys on this call? Any compliance enforcement attorney regulators? No. Okay. Folks, we've got about 3 minutes left. Anyone has a last kind of question or thought that they want to throw out there or bounce off of? Seeing none. Director Gaudino, would you like to close us out here before I?
I'm not sure I can, only because I'm still reeling from the fact that this is so logical. It makes my brain hurt. And it really is quite frustrating because, and I'm not trying to rant or have everybody feel like I need a pity party, but I've spent my entire cannabis research career avoiding working with type 1 cannabis so that I didn't have to worry about THC. I've worked only on non-intoxicating cannabinoids, and now I find myself being sucked into an area that I shouldn't be because and suddenly my work falls under Schedule 1 for no reason. So I'm as baffled and frustrated by all this as everybody else. So unfortunately.
I will add, these rules are very complicated and head spinning, but there's a need for research to be able to inform many of the policy decisions that I think still need to be made around cannabis and how it should be regulated. I think the other piece is that the what I have really seen is despite all these challenges recently, there's been quite a bit of headway in the research. And I know that there is an effort to make sure to continue to do that. And Reggie, your work is very important. And I think it's very important that you continue to do what you're doing in order to be able to inform many of the decisions that need to be made.
And affirming, seconding, confirming everything Agnes said. Also, the definitions of hemp are not in effect yet. It is not entirely impossible that they are redefined and that there are changes to those definitions. PWCE, to your point, to Reggie, your point on lobbying, one of the primary lobbying entities is trying to get a carve out for beverages only. So it continues to play out, and until there are rules and regs, it is an unknown. But thank you all for joining us today. We are right at time. We do have a poll that I think, Katsali, you might have dropped into chat, or it'll launch when the meeting ends. And then if folks are interested in connecting with us or learning more, there's a QR code on screen that you can just grab and work in magic that way. But thank you all. And if anyone's interested in wonking out on any of the policy implications and other aspects that I didn't even touch, please reach out.